It was a chilly night in the spring of 1968 when Sheila Garvey, an elegant farmer's wife, woke up in the darkness of her luxury farmhouse in Kincardineshire, Scotland. Beside her, the body of her husband, Maxwell Garvey, lay still, his life snuffed out in the most brutal of ways, bludgeoned and shot as he slept. This wasn't just any murder. What unfolded in the days, months, and years that followed became one of Scotland's most salacious, bizarre, and talked-about crimes. A case so shocking, it rocked even the most reserved Scottish villages to their core. A husband, a wife, a lover, and an orgy of betrayal that spiraled into murder. But what drove Sheila, a wife and mother, to plot her husband's violent death? Was it love, greed, or simply the chaotic aftermath of a scandalous life lived on the edge? And how did a young mechanic, Brian Tevendale, become her accomplice in this gruesome act? As detectives peeled back the layers of this shocking case, they unearthed secrets that stunned everyone. A nudist colony, foursomes with a policeman's wife, coin tosses to decide who would share Sheila's bed, and a dark, twisted love triangle that led to murder. The farmhouse, once seen as a picture-perfect home, was nicknamed Kinky Cottage by locals. Behind its pristine walls were parties drenched in alcohol, lust, and shifting loyalties. Maxwell Garvey, the flamboyant and thrill-seeking husband, had a taste for the unconventional. He thrived on risk, indulging in wild sexual escapades, drugs, and dangerous flying stunts. But Max didn't realize that the very world he built would become his undoing. When his lifeless body was found 3 months later, hidden in a drain near Lauriston Castle, the murder shocked the public. The courtroom trial that followed revealed a tale of passion, betrayal, and blood that played out like the most sordid of dramas. Reporters flooded the courts. Church leaders condemned it as a warning of sin leading to destruction, and crowds queued in the dead of night just to hear the scandalous evidence laid bare. But the story doesn't stop at the crime or the courtroom. The aftermath of this tragedy lingered for decades, as those involved, survivors of their own twisted web, tried to rebuild their lives. So what really happened on that fateful night in May 1968? How did a respectable Scottish couple become the center of one of the most scandalous and disturbing cases in the nation's history? Stay with us as we journey back to the remote farmlands of Kincardineshire and unravel the twisted story of Sheila Garvey, the woman at the center of it all, and her deadly love affair with Brian Tevendale. Before we dive into this unbelievable case, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And let us know in the comments, what do you think drives a person to murder someone they once loved? Your thoughts might just spark the next discussion. In the rolling hills of Kincardineshire, Scotland, the Garvey family appeared to have it all. Their West Cairnbeg farm was the definition of rural affluence, a sprawling estate where money flowed as freely as the whiskey at their now infamous parties. At the heart of this family was Maxwell Robert Garvey, a 35-year-old farmer and businessman, often described as a man of charm, wealth, and ambition. He was an entrepreneur who had turned his family farm into a thriving business, reaping financial success that afforded him fast cars, private planes, and a life most could only dream of. By his side was his wife, Sheila Garvey, the picture of elegance and restraint. Tall, attractive, and fashion-forward, Sheila turned heads wherever she went. From the outside, they seemed like the quintessential upper-class couple, a loving family with 3 children, financial security, and status within their community. But the reality of their marriage was far darker. Behind the ornate farmhouse doors, Maxwell's insatiable appetites were beginning to erode the family's facade of respectability. He had grown increasingly bored with his picture-perfect life. Fast cars and flying stunts were no longer enough. Instead, Max turned his attention to sex, nudism, and elaborate parties, where social boundaries were pushed and broken. In the early 1960s, Max helped found a nudist club in the sheltered grounds of their estate, a secret that scandalized the otherwise quiet conservative countryside. At first, these gatherings were little more than innocent social experiments, but they soon descended into orgies, where partners were swapped and secrets were shared. Sheila, reluctant at first, was coerced into participation. The marital bed, once private, became a stage for debauchery, and Kinky Cottage, as the locals came to call it, became legendary for its excesses. It was during these tumultuous years that Brian Tevendale, a handsome 22-year-old mechanic and family acquaintance, entered the picture. Brian was a young man full of ambition, but limited by his circumstances. He began helping out at the Garvey farm on weekends, quickly becoming a trusted part of their lives. But Max had plans for Brian that went beyond fixing machinery or tending to the estate. Max, always pushing boundaries, began manipulating Sheila and Brian into increasingly uncomfortable scenarios. One night, in a particularly unsettling act of control, Max shoved his naked wife into Brian's bedroom, forcing her to spend the night with the young man. This event marked the turning point for Sheila. What began as manipulation would soon evolve into a deadly love affair, one that Max himself set in motion. Brian and Sheila fell for each other in secret, their forbidden relationship fueled by passion and resentment toward Max's domineering and often violent behavior. The parties continued, escalating to foreign-abed affairs that involved Brian's sister, Trudy Bursey, and her policeman husband, Fred Bursey. The scandal grew with every passing week, as rumors swirled and relationships became tangled in a chaotic web of lust, control, and betrayal. Max's reckless lifestyle began to take a toll. Described as a man with a low boredom threshold, he constantly sought new thrills. When he grew tired of Trudy Bursey, his mistress, he insisted that Sheila and Brian end their affair and that they both find new playmates. But by this time, Sheila had fallen deeply for Brian, and Max's attempts to separate them only deepened the resentment. Max, who had once orchestrated the intimate games that brought them together, suddenly found himself an obstacle to their relationship. He became violent, paranoid, and erratic. Fearing for her safety and desperate for freedom, Sheila and Brian began to see only one way out. Max had to die. On the night of May 14th, 1968, the plan unfolded. It was a night that would forever change their lives and shock the nation. Sheila lay beside Max in bed, pretending everything was normal. At her signal, she slipped out and opened the door to Brian Tevendale and his accomplice, Alan Peters. Armed with Max's own .22 rifle, Brian struck first, smashing Max's skull with the rifle butt. To ensure he was dead, Brian placed a pillow over Max's face and fired a single shot to his head. They wrapped his lifeless body in a blanket, dumped it into the trunk of Alan Peters' car, and drove to Lauriston Castle, where they discarded him in an underground drain. For 3 agonizing months, Maxwell Garvey was listed as missing, while Sheila maintained a chilling facade of innocence. The disappearance of Maxwell Garvey set off one of Scotland's most puzzling mysteries. Local authorities launched a massive search operation, draining wells, combing woods, and interrogating friends and family. But Max was nowhere to be found. For months, the community whispered theories. Had Max fled? Was this a prank orchestrated by the thrill-seeker himself? Or had something far more sinister taken place? The answer would come 3 months later, when Sheila Garvey's own mother broke the silence that shielded the truth. What she revealed to the police cracked open the case, leading to the discovery of Max's decaying body and the arrest of 3 people: Sheila Garvey, her lover Brian Tevendale, and their accomplice, Alan Peters. The stage was now set for one of the most sordid murder trials Scotland had ever seen, a trial that would expose the secrets of Kinky Cottage and leave an entire nation in disbelief. Maxwell Robert Garvey, known to friends and family simply as Max, was born on October 26, 1934, into a well-respected farming family in Kincardineshire, Scotland. The Garvey family were prominent landowners, deeply embedded in the fabric of rural Scottish life. From a young age, Max showed intelligence, charisma, and a knack for business, a combination that set him apart in his close-knit community. Growing up, Max was the golden boy of Kincardineshire. He excelled at school, his natural charm making him popular among both peers and adults. As he grew older, his ambition became clear. While other young men followed traditional farming routines, Max had bigger plans. He modernized his family's farm operations, transforming it into a thriving, profitable business. By his early 30s, Max was far wealthier than many of his peers. his success enabling him to indulge in an increasingly luxurious lifestyle. Max's success didn't just manifest in business. He cultivated a personal image as a man who lived for excitement and excess. While most farmers in the area lived modestly, Max stood out with his flashy cars, a private plane, and his taste for expensive clothes. He craved risk, pushing boundaries both in his professional and personal life. Those who knew him spoke of his low boredom threshold. Max wasn't content with ordinary pursuits. His fascination with flying became a hallmark of his thrill-seeking personality. He purchased his own plane and often performed dangerous stunts over the North Sea, flying hands-free to impress friends and neighbors. To Max, life was a game, and he loved playing it to the edge. But while he indulged in reckless adventures, his behavior often veered into darker territories. Max's need for excitement bled into his relationships, particularly with his wife, Sheila Garvey. The couple married in 1955, when Max was 21 and Sheila was 20. At first, their marriage appeared idyllic. They were young, attractive, and wealthy, and soon had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. Sheila, elegant and devoted, supported her husband's ambitions and cared for their children while Max managed the farm. But over time, Max's desires began to outgrow his marriage. He became restless, seeking out new thrills that would test both his boundaries and Sheila's loyalty. By the early 1960s, Max's life took a bizarre turn. He became fascinated with nudism, initially promoting it as a harmless social experiment. With his considerable wealth and influence, he founded a nudist club on the grounds of his estate, planting a triangle of trees and thick bushes to shield it from prying eyes. To outsiders, this was eccentric behavior. To those close to Max, it marked the start of his unraveling. Soon, the nudist gatherings escalated into wild parties, where alcohol flowed freely. Inhibitions vanished and couples swapped partners. Max thrived on these escapades, pushing the limits further each time. He reportedly persuaded Sheila, who was initially horrified and reluctant, to join these sordid affairs. Friends and acquaintances were invited, including Trudy Bursey, the sister of Max's future killer, Brian Tevendale. Trudy, a policeman's wife, became Max's lover. It was said that Trudy's husband joined in these group encounters, with Max arranging an additional female partner for him. Stories of four-in-a-bed romps quickly spread through the conservative countryside, earning the Garvey farmhouse its infamous nickname, Kinky Cottage. For Sheila, these moments of excess were far from enjoyable. Once a devoted housewife and mother, she had become a reluctant participant in Max's increasingly depraved world. The once glamorous marriage was now rife with resentment, betrayal, and emotional manipulation. As the years passed, Max's behavior became more erratic and domineering. He pressured Sheila into situations that left her humiliated and broken. One particularly disturbing incident saw Max shoving his naked wife into the bedroom of Brian Tevendale, the 22-year-old mechanic Max had invited into their lives. Max insisted on Sheila's involvement with other men, taking a twisted satisfaction in observing and controlling these encounters. This growing control began to backfire. In his arrogance, Max overlooked the emotional consequences of his actions. By forcing Sheila and Brian together, he unknowingly planted the seeds of his own destruction. While Max viewed these encounters as part of his games, Sheila and Brian's relationship deepened into something far more dangerous: love. Max, however, didn't stop there. He grew bored of Trudy Bursey, dismissing her as easily as he had welcomed her into his life. He demanded that Sheila end her relationship with Brian and that they both find new playmates. For a man who thrived on control, the idea that Sheila and Brian were genuinely attached to each other became a threat, one Max couldn't tolerate. At this point, Max's life began to unravel. Friends and neighbors noticed his increasingly volatile behavior, his heavy drinking and his reckless stunts. He was no longer the charming, ambitious farmer they once admired, but a man spiraling toward his demise. On the surface, Maxwell Garvey was a successful, respected member of Scottish society, a wealthy farmer, businessman, and family man. But beneath this facade lay a man whose insatiable need for control and excitement pushed him into dangerous territory. By 1968, Max's world had grown too chaotic to sustain, and his own actions had paved the way for his brutal and untimely death. Little did he know that the people he manipulated, his wife Sheila and her lover Brian Tevendale, were plotting his downfall. In their eyes, the only escape from Max's domination was his murder. The story of Max Garvey is one of ambition turned to arrogance, love turned to betrayal, and thrill-seeking turned to tragedy. His violent death marked the end of a man who had everything but pushed it all too far. On the morning of May 15, 1968, the normally bustling West Cairnbeg farm in Kincardineshire, Scotland, was unusually quiet. The charismatic and often unpredictable Maxwell Garvey, the man who filled every room he entered, was nowhere to be seen. To anyone who knew Max, this absence was odd. He lived life loudly, thriving on attention, so for him to vanish without a word raised immediate suspicion. It was Sheila Garvey, his wife, who first made a subtle but calculated effort to cover for his absence. Calmly and deliberately, Sheila told friends and neighbors that Max had likely gone on one of his impulsive trips. She claimed he'd been restless the night before and might have taken off in his car to clear his head. After all, Max was known for his erratic behavior, whether it was daredevil flying stunts or disappearing for short getaways. No one ever questioned his wild streak. But this time was different. Days passed and there was no sign of Max. His private plane sat unused. His car, normally seen tearing across rural roads, was abandoned, found bizarrely parked across a runway at Fordon Flying Club, a small private airfield. It was as if Max had vanished into thin air. The locals grew uneasy, whispering questions. Where was Max? What could possibly explain his disappearance? On May 19, 1968, Maxwell Garvey's sister, Hilda Kerr, officially reported him missing to the police. The seemingly innocent disappearance quickly escalated into a full-scale investigation as the authorities began to realize there was far more to this story than anyone was letting on. At first, the police treated Max's disappearance as a missing persons case. Friends and family were interviewed, and the authorities began retracing Max's final movements. The last confirmed sighting of Max was on the evening of May 14th, when he attended a Scottish National Party meeting in nearby Stonehaven. He had reportedly returned home later that night, where Sheila claimed they went to bed as usual. But where was Max now? Search teams combed the surrounding farmland, wooded areas, and nearby rivers. Wells were drained, helicopters buzzed overhead. Authorities even focused on the Fordown airfield where his car had been left. Yet despite their exhaustive efforts, no trace of Max was found. For weeks, the case baffled investigators. Sheila remained eerily calm, playing the role of the concerned wife. In public, she spoke softly about how worried she was for her husband's safety. Privately, however, her cool composure unnerved some of those closest to her. As rumors of the Garveys' wild lifestyle began to surface, the police grew increasingly suspicious of Sheila. The turning point in the investigation came 3 months later, in August 1968. Sheila's carefully constructed facade began to crack. She couldn't escape the weight of her guilt or the relentless pressure of public scrutiny. In a moment of weakness, Sheila confided in her mother, Edith Watson, who had long been aware of the dysfunction in her daughter's marriage. With trembling words, Sheila hinted that Max was dead and implied that her lover, Brian Tevendale, was responsible for his disappearance. Edith Watson, a law-abiding and deeply religious woman, was horrified. Unable to carry such a dark secret, she went straight to the police. The moment Edith spoke to investigators, the walls began closing in on Sheila and Brian. Detectives descended on West Cairnbeg Farm, this time with a renewed determination to find out what had happened to Max. On August 17, 1968, 3 months after Max's disappearance, the search led police to Lauriston Castle near St. Cyrus, a village not far from Brian Tevendale's home. There, in an underground drain, officers uncovered the rotting, putrefied remains of Maxwell Garvey. The scene was haunting. Max's body had been hastily dumped, wrapped in a blanket like discarded rubbish. His skull bore the brutal evidence of his death, a blow to the head and a single bullet wound that had been fired through a pillow to muffle the sound. The smell of decay lingered in the air, a stark reminder of how long his body had been hidden. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. The once respected Garvey family name was now at the center of a horrific murder case. Local villagers, who had long whispered about the goings-on at Kinky Cottage, were horrified to learn the full extent of the crime. For the police, this gruesome find answered the question of where Max had gone, but the biggest mystery remained: who killed him and why? With the body recovered, investigators wasted no time closing in on their suspects. On August 16, 1968, police arrested Sheila Garvey, her lover Brian Tevendale, and their friend Alan Peters, a 20-year-old mechanic and close associate of Brian's. The arrest of Sheila sent shockwaves through the community. How could a mother of three, described as elegant and demure, be implicated in such a heinous crime? And what role had her much younger lover Brian played in the murder? As news of the arrests spread, details of the Garveys' scandalous lifestyle began to leak to the public. Reports of nudism, sex parties, and bizarre affairs fueled a media frenzy. Church leaders decried the events as a warning of moral decay. Headlines screamed of a love triangle turned deadly. With Sheila and Brian painted as the star-crossed lovers at the heart of it all, the police, meanwhile, were building their case. According to the prosecution, the murder had been meticulously planned. Sheila had allegedly persuaded Brian to kill Max so they could be together, free of his domineering influence. On the night of the murder, Sheila had shared the bed with Max, feigning normalcy. In the early hours of May 15th, she had slipped out of bed, unlocked the farmhouse door, and let Brian and Alan inside. Armed with a .22 rifle belonging to Max, Brian delivered the fatal blows, first smashing Max's skull with the rifle butt, then firing a shot into his head to ensure he was dead. After the killing, the three drank an entire bottle of whiskey to calm their nerves before disposing of Max's body. It was an act so cold and calculated that even seasoned investigators were stunned. With Sheila, Brian, and Alan now in custody, the community struggled to process the gravity of the crime. The farmhouse, once known as Kinky Cottage, became a symbol of excess and tragedy. For months, newspapers carried lurid stories of the Garvey family's twisted private life, feeding a public that was both horrified and fascinated. The stage was now set for a sensational murder trial that would expose every dark corner of Max's life and the deadly betrayal that ended it. With the gruesome discovery of Maxwell Garvey's body on August 17, 1968, the investigation shifted gears. What had started as a missing persons case 3 months earlier had now escalated into a full-fledged murder inquiry. The sheer brutality of Max's death, his skull shattered, a bullet to the head, sent shockwaves through the community. But for investigators, the crime scene revealed little about why Max had been killed or who was responsible. The first step for authorities was to retrace Max's final hours. Witnesses confirmed that on the night of May 14, 1968, Max attended a Scottish National Party (SNP) meeting in nearby Stonehaven. By all accounts, he had been his usual self, charismatic and outgoing if a little restless. After the meeting ended, Max returned to his farmhouse at West Cairnbeg, where his wife Sheila said they went to bed as usual. From there, the timeline became murky. Sheila claimed she woke up the next morning to find Max gone. His car, later discovered abandoned at the Fordune Flying Club, added to the mystery. But police weren't convinced by Sheila's version of events. Her demeanor, calm, calculated, and curiously unshaken, raised red flags. As investigators began their interviews, it became clear that the Garvey household was far from ordinary. Friends and acquaintances described a family teetering on the edge of chaos, with tales of wild parties, nudist gatherings, and whispered rumors of affairs that sounded almost too sordid to be true. The most striking detail came from neighbors, who hinted at Max's volatile behavior and his increasingly strained relationship with Sheila. "He ruled the house like a king," one acquaintance reportedly said. Max's domineering personality and taste for control had made him enemies even within his own home. Then came the whispers of Brian Tevendale, the young mechanic who had become a fixture at West Cairnbeg. When questioned, locals described Brian as quiet and trustworthy, a stark contrast to the flamboyant Max. but rumors swirled that Brian and Sheila's relationship had grown far more intimate than it should have. Police began to suspect that Sheila's bond with Brian was not only emotional, but potentially deadly. Detectives zeroed in on Sheila Garvey, whose calm and cooperative front began to falter under scrutiny. Her statements about Max's disappearance were riddled with inconsistencies. For instance, why had she not reported Max missing immediately? Sheila insisted that Max's frequent disappearances had made her reluctant to worry the police, but this seemed unlikely, given the abandonment of his car. Why was Sheila's account of May 14th so vague? She struggled to recall basic details about the evening, including when she and Max had gone to bed. Behind closed doors, detectives suspected Sheila knew far more than she was letting on. Their suspicions intensified when they learned about Edith Watson, Sheila's mother. It was Edith who first hinted that Max was dead and that Sheila's lover, Brian Tevendale, was responsible. Investigators began piecing together a web of secrets and lies, all of which pointed toward Sheila and Brian. With Sheila under surveillance, police turned their focus to Brian Tevendale, the 22-year-old mechanic with a clean-cut image and a troubled past. Brian had worked odd jobs at the Garvey farm for months and had become something of a confidant to Sheila. To outsiders, Brian appeared shy and reserved, but investigators soon uncovered details of his complex relationship with Sheila, a bond that had been manipulated and encouraged by Max himself. Friends reported that Max had frequently pushed Sheila and Brian together, forcing Sheila into uncomfortable situations, including spending the night with Brian. What started as coercion had evolved into something far more dangerous, a love affair fueled by resentment, shame, and a desire for escape. Police questioned Brian at length, but he maintained his innocence. He admitted to being close to Sheila, but denied any involvement in Max's disappearance. Still, Brian's nervous demeanor and the mounting evidence against him made him a key suspect. A third name soon emerged in the investigation: Alan Peters, a 20-year-old mechanic and friend of Brian's. Alan was known to authorities as a quiet, impressionable young man who often followed Brian's lead. Witnesses reported seeing Brian and Alan together on multiple occasions around the time of Max's disappearance. When police brought Alan in for questioning, his story began to crumble. Unlike Brian, who remained tight-lipped, Alan appeared visibly shaken. Under pressure, Alan began to hint at the truth, a truth that would blow the case wide open. According to Alan, on the night of May 14th, Brian had confided in him about a plan to get rid of Max. Alan claimed he hadn't believed Brian at the time, thinking it was just idle talk. But as the investigation progressed, Alan's involvement became harder to deny. The breakthrough investigators needed came in the form of Max's .22 rifle. Police learned that Max had owned a rifle, which was missing from the Garvey home. Further investigation revealed that Brian Tevendale had been seen with a similar rifle in the days leading up to Max's disappearance. For detectives, this detail tied the pieces together. Sheila had provided Brian and Alan with access to the Garvey home. Brian had used Max's own weapon to commit the murder. Alan had assisted in disposing of the body, helping Brian dump Max's remains in the underground drain at Lauriston Castle. The rifle became the critical link connecting the suspects to the crime. With this evidence in hand, police felt confident they were closing in on the truth. As the investigation progressed, detectives uncovered a chilling narrative of manipulation, betrayal, and premeditated murder. Max Garvey, once the puppet master of his wife and their young lover, had unwittingly created the very circumstances that led to his death. Sheila and Brian, desperate for freedom from Max's control, had chosen a path that ended in bloodshed. By the end of August 1968, police had enough evidence to make their move. The arrests of Sheila Garvey, Brian Tevendale, and Alan Peters sent shockwaves through the quiet countryside. The story of Kinky Cottage, already infamous for its debauchery, had now become the scene of a murder most foul. But the investigation was far from over. What followed was a courtroom drama that would expose every sordid detail of the Garveys' twisted lives and seal the fate of those involved. By the end of August 1968, the case against Sheila Garvey and Brian Tevendale was growing stronger. Investigators had pieced together a disturbing timeline of events that pointed squarely at the two lovers. Sheila, once seen as a devoted housewife, was now emerging as the architect of a cold-blooded murder, and Brian, her young and infatuated accomplice, was being pulled deeper into the center of the investigation. The story playing out in police interrogations was chilling. Detectives began focusing on Sheila's motive. Why would a seemingly ordinary woman agree to kill her husband? The answers they uncovered painted a dark picture of a woman pushed to the edge by a man who had taken control of every aspect of her life. For years, Max's domination had humiliated and broken Sheila. The forced orgies, the sexual coercion, the public affairs, all had left her feeling trapped. Yet rather than walking away, Sheila and Brian had chosen murder as their escape. Investigators were now tasked with proving it. While Sheila and Brian maintained a tight front during questioning, the weakest link in their conspiracy was Alan Peters. Alan was a reluctant participant in the events that unfolded that night, a young, impressionable man who had been swept up in Brian's orbit. Initially, Alan denied any involvement, but as the weight of the evidence grew, so did the pressure on him. Investigators presented him with the missing rifle, Max's own weapon, now identified as the murder weapon, and revealed new witness statements placing Alan and Brian together near Lauriston Castle around the time Max disappeared. Under mounting pressure, Alan Peters cracked. In a shaky confession, he admitted to helping Brian dispose of Max's body, but insisted he hadn't participated in the actual murder. According to Alan, Brian had called on him for help after the killing was already done. Alan's confession revealed grisly details. On the night of May 14th, Sheila slipped out of bed after Max fell asleep. She unlocked the farmhouse door, allowing Brian and Alan inside. Brian, armed with Max's .22 rifle, struck Max in the head with the rifle butt, shattering his skull. To ensure Max was dead, Brian placed a pillow over his face and fired a single bullet into his head. Shaken and desperate, Brian and Alan wrapped Max's lifeless body in a blanket, carried it to Alan's car, and drove to the underground drain at Lauriston Castle, where they dumped the body. Alan's statement was a game-changer. While he downplayed his own role, his confession provided detectives with the missing sequence of events. It also confirmed Sheila's active participation in the murder, as she had enabled the killers to enter the house and witness the brutal act unfold. With Alan Peters' confession, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Police now had the murder weapon, Max's own .22 rifle, retrieved during the investigation. Alan's testimony, a first-hand account of how the murder was committed and how Max's body was disposed of. The motive, Sheila and Brian's desire to escape Max's dominance and pursue their relationship. Detectives also gathered circumstantial evidence that further implicated Sheila and Brian. Neighbors recalled seeing Brian at the Garvey farmhouse late at night in the weeks leading up to Max's disappearance. Witnesses also reported Brian's suspicious behavior in the days following Max's murder. He had been unusually agitated and withdrawn. Investigators worked methodically to connect the dots. They reconstructed the crime timeline, matching Alan's confession to the physical evidence. The final moments of Max's life were clear. He had been attacked while sleeping in his bed, betrayed by the very people he trusted most. With Alan Peters' confession in hand, police turned their attention back to Sheila Garvey. Her calm demeanor, which had unnerved detectives from the start, began to waver under the weight of the evidence. Sheila continued to deny involvement, insisting that she had been asleep during the murder. However, when confronted with Alan's damning testimony, Sheila's carefully constructed story began to unravel. Detectives pushed her, pointing out the inconsistencies in her account and presenting the mounting evidence against her. Sheila's responses grew more defensive, and cracks began to form in her facade. Behind the scenes, investigators believed Sheila's motive extended beyond her love for Brian. They uncovered details of Max's life insurance policies. Sheila stood to gain a significant sum of money, including a £55,000 payout from just one policy. Combined with her resentment toward Max and her desire to be free of his control, the evidence painted a picture of a premeditated murder fueled by both greed and desperation. While Sheila's motives were layered, Brian Tevendale's role in the murder was equally complex. Brian was described by those who knew him as young, naive, and deeply infatuated with Sheila. Investigators believed that Brian had been manipulated, first by Max, who forced him into Sheila's bed, and later by Sheila, who convinced him that killing Max was the only way forward. When questioned, Brian remained stoic but visibly shaken. He admitted to his love for Sheila but denied planning the murder himself. In his version of events, Sheila had orchestrated everything. Brian claimed that he went along with the plan out of devotion and fear of losing her. To the police, Brian's story was both tragic and damning. He had been driven to commit an unthinkable act, blinded by his obsession with a woman who, in the end, may have used him as a pawn in her own deadly game. By late August 1968, investigators had enough evidence to charge all three suspects. Sheila Garvey, charged with orchestrating and enabling the murder of her husband. Brian Tevendale, charged with carrying out the murder. Alan Peters, charged as an accessory for helping to dispose of Max's body. For the people of Kincardineshire, the story was incomprehensible. How had a seemingly perfect family spiraled into such depravity and violence? What drove a wife and her young lover to murder? And what would the trial reveal about the events leading up to Max's gruesome death? The stage was now set for a sensational courtroom drama, one that would expose the darkest secrets of the Garvey family and leave an entire nation stunned. The High Court of Aberdeen was no stranger to serious cases, but on November 19, 1968, it played host to one of the most sensational trials Scotland had ever witnessed. The courtroom, usually a place of order and quiet, buzzed with activity long before dawn. People lined up outside as early as 3 a.m., determined to witness the scandalous proceedings. Journalists flocked from every corner of the country, pens ready to document the sordid details that had gripped the public's imagination. At the center of the storm sat Sheila Garvey, calm and composed, dressed impeccably as though attending a social gathering rather than a murder trial. Her expression betrayed nothing. No fear, no remorse. To her right was Brian Tevendale, the young mechanic whose life had become entangled in a web of lust, betrayal, and bloodshed. Brian looked a shadow of himself, pale, hollow-eyed, and visibly shaken by the gravity of what lay ahead. The prosecution wasted no time. From the moment the trial began, the Crown laid out its damning version of events. The story they told was one of obsession and manipulation. A tale of how Sheila Garvey, trapped in an oppressive marriage, had orchestrated her husband's brutal murder with the help of her lover. The jury listened intently as the prosecutor described Max Garvey's final night, painting a chilling picture of betrayal unfolding within the walls of the farmhouse that locals now referred to as Kinky Cottage. Max, they argued, had gone to bed unaware that his wife Sheila had set a deadly plan into motion. Under the cover of darkness, she had slipped out of their shared bed, unlocked the farmhouse door, and allowed her lover Brian to enter. Armed with Max's own .22 rifle, Brian struck him in the skull with the rifle butt before placing a pillow over his face and pulling the trigger. The shot echoed through the room, muffled by the very bed that had once been a place of trust. The prosecutor's voice rose as he recounted what happened next. Brian, joined by Alan Peters, a reluctant accomplice, carried Max's lifeless body out of the house, wrapped in a blanket, and drove to Lauriston Castle. There, they dumped him into an underground drain like discarded rubbish, leaving him to rot for 3 months. It was a cold and calculated crime, the prosecution insisted, one that could not have been carried out without Sheila's guidance. The courtroom fell silent when the murder weapon was presented. The sight of the rifle, stained with blood, was a stark reminder of the violence that had ended Max Garvey's life. But the most shocking moment came when the prosecution unveiled a piece of evidence that no one in the room would soon forget. Max's yellowed skull, a grim relic of his final moments. The display was so grotesque that one of the jurors fainted, a clear reflection of the horror this case had brought to light. As the Crown made its case, they called Alan Peters to the stand. The young man, pale and trembling, recounted the events of that night in detail, his words punctuated by audible gasps from the public gallery. Alan confessed that he had helped Brian dispose of the body, though he claimed he was coerced into the act, fearful of the consequences of refusing his friend. His testimony painted Brian as the killer and Sheila as the mastermind, the one who had set the plan in motion. While the prosecution's case was devastating, the defense attempted to tell a very different story. Sheila's counsel portrayed her as a broken woman, someone pushed to her limit by years of humiliation and domination at the hands of her husband. The defense argued that Max had forced Sheila into degrading scenarios, including unwanted sexual encounters with other men. According to Sheila, she had been nothing more than an unwilling participant in Brian's plot. She claimed to have been asleep during the murder, waking only to find her husband dead and Brian confessing to the crime. Brian's defense, on the other hand, sought to portray him as a lovesick pawn, a young man manipulated by Sheila's stories of abuse and desperation. His counsel argued that Brian had acted out of misguided devotion, believing that killing Max was the only way to free Sheila from her torment. It was Sheila, they insisted, who had planted the idea of murder in Brian's mind and encouraged him to carry it out. For days, the trial played out like a twisted drama, with Sheila and Brian, once inseparable, now turning on one another to save themselves. The courtroom watched as the two former lovers, bound by their shared guilt, accused each other of masterminding the crime. The tension between them was palpable, a silent battle for survival unfolding before the jury's eyes. By the time closing arguments were made, the jury had been taken on a journey through betrayal, lust, and greed. The prosecution argued that Sheila and Brian were equally responsible for the murder, a wife who had grown to hate her husband and a lover willing to kill for her affection. The defense, meanwhile, begged for leniency, portraying both as victims of a toxic relationship that spiraled out of control. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The silence was deafening as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. First came Alan Peters. The jury found the case against him, not proven. A uniquely Scottish verdict that left him neither guilty nor innocent, but free to walk away. Then came Brian Tevendale. The jury delivered a unanimous guilty verdict for the murder of Maxwell Garvey. Brian slumped in his seat, his face pale and hollow, as the weight of his actions finally came crashing down. Finally, all eyes turned to Sheila Garvey. The foreman read out the verdict, guilty by majority. The woman who had once appeared calm and composed now sat motionless, her expression unreadable as the judge sentenced both her and Brian to life imprisonment. As the courtroom erupted into whispers, the nation's newspapers wasted no time. Headlines screamed of Kinky Cottage murder, detailing the sordid revelations of nudism, orgies, and betrayal. For the people of Kincardineshire, the case became a cautionary tale of excess and destruction. Some saw Sheila as a victim, a woman broken by a cruel and domineering husband. Others condemned her as a manipulative schemer who had lured a young man into committing murder. As Sheila and Brian were led away to begin their sentences, the once glamorous Garvey family was no more. The farmhouse that had been the scene of so much scandal stood empty, its dark secrets finally exposed. The trial had brought justice for Maxwell Garvey, but it left a nation reeling, a community forever haunted by the story of Kinky Cottage and the deadly betrayal that had unfolded behind its doors. When the doors of the Aberdeen High Court closed and the trial ended, the story of Maxwell Garvey's murder refused to fade quietly into history. Instead, it lingered in the minds of the public, a sordid tale of betrayal, scandal, and murder that left an enduring mark on Scotland's collective memory. The people of Kincardineshire, a quiet, rural community, were shaken to their core. This wasn't London or Glasgow. This was their home, where gossip was whispered in hushed tones and the notion of scandal was unthinkable. Now, their small patch of farmland was infamous across the country. Kinky Cottage, once a symbol of wealth and success, had become a house of horrors, a name spoken with both fascination and disdain. Neighbors who had once admired the Garvey family for their prosperity and charm now struggled to reconcile what they had known with the shocking truth. The stories of nudism, orgies, and coin tosses to decide Sheila's lovers were more than rumors. They were headlines. Community leaders condemned the events as a cautionary tale, a moral failure that had spiraled into violence. Churches across Scotland used the case to deliver fiery sermons about the dangers of indulgence and sin. In their view, the downfall of the Garvey family was divine retribution, a warning that when boundaries are pushed too far, destruction is inevitable. For months after the trial, whispers of the Kinky Cottage case echoed in pubs, living rooms, and marketplaces. For Sheila Garvey, life behind bars began with the same calm composure she had displayed in court. Sentenced to life imprisonment, she was viewed with a mixture of hatred and morbid fascination. To some, Sheila was the ultimate manipulator, a woman who lured a young man into committing murder. To others, she was a victim of her husband's excesses, a woman driven to desperate acts by years of humiliation and control. Sheila served 10 years in prison before her release in 1978. Her life after incarceration was quieter, but no less marked by scandal. She married twice more, first to a Rhodesian welder, a marriage that ended in divorce, and then to a drilling engineer named Charles Mitchell. With Charles, she finally found some stability and respectability, living quietly in Stonehaven and running a small bed and breakfast. Her days of scandal were over, but her name remained forever tied to one of Scotland's most shocking crimes. Brian Tevendale, the young man who had once been an innocent farmhand, emerged from prison a changed man. He, too, served 10 years and was released in 1978. Seeking anonymity, he moved to Perthshire, where he eventually married and became the landlord of a local village pub. Brian rarely spoke of the events that had defined his early life. Those who knew him later in life described him as quiet and reflective, a man forever burdened by his past. He died in 2003 of a suspected heart attack, days before he was due to leave Scotland to start a new life in Gambia. The third accomplice, Alan Peters, who had walked free after his, not proven, verdict, remained largely in the shadows. While his role in disposing of Max's body was undeniable, he escaped the consequences faced by Sheila and Brian. Alan died in 2007, having avoided the notoriety that haunted the others. The murder of Maxwell Garvey remains one of Scotland's most infamous crimes, not just because of its brutality, but because of the sordid details that accompanied it. It exposed a side of rural life that few had ever imagined, a world of secrecy, manipulation, and excess hidden behind the walls of privilege. For the Garvey children, Wendy, Angela, and Lloyd, the case was a lifelong shadow. They were left to grapple with the stigma of their family name and the loss of both parents in a tragedy that played out on a national stage. While the world fixated on their mother and the shocking trial, the children were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The farmhouse at West Cairnbeg, once the hub of parties and scandal, stood empty for years, a silent witness to the events that unfolded within its walls. The name, Kinky Cottage, became synonymous with the dangers of excess, a cautionary tale passed down through generations. Ultimately, the case left behind more than just a headline. It became a story of how love, greed, and betrayal could turn even the most privileged lives into a nightmare of destruction. For those who lived through it, the memory of Maxwell Garvey's murder remains an unsettling reminder that even the most idyllic facades can hide the darkest of truths. It's a haunting reminder of how far human desires can spiral out of control when boundaries are erased and trust is broken. Was Sheila Garvey a victim, or was she the master manipulator who orchestrated her husband's death? Did Brian Tevendale act out of love, or was he simply another pawn in a deadly game? Perhaps we'll never know the full truth, but the lessons remain clear beneath even the most perfect facades. Darkness can lurk. If you found this story as compelling as we did, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know your thoughts. Was justice served? And stay tuned for more gripping true crime stories that prove sometimes truth is stranger than fiction.